Biofriendly Podcast. It's the Biofriendly Podcast.
That's such a new feature. We've been doing Zoom podcast interviews for like a year now.
We fooled so many guests.
So many guests had no idea.
Didn't know they
had no idea.
Yeah. But now, no longer.
Now they know. Now
Zoom is informing.
Now, including our guest today.
We have a guest today,
We have a guest
Jacob?
today on the Biofriendly Podcast.
This is fantastic.
Yes.
Who do we have?
Today, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Biofriendly Podcast, Dr. Mark C. Trexler.
Hey, welcome, Mark.
Mark is the, I want to make sure I get this right, he is the chief climatographer at the Climatographers.
That is
And
correct.
Yes. So I did it right?
Yes.
That's the role.
That's
Not that you have any idea what that means,
Well,
but
what's
yes, you
awesome
got it
about
right.
that,
No.
about that is that of like, there are climatographers.
Yeah.
And of the climatographers, we got the chief.
The top.
Yeah.
Top of the line. We don't mess around on this podcast.
No, we don't. We try to. Well, we try. Well, we do.
Yeah, we did. No,
We
actually, it's a
mostly
really
mess around
good
with
point. We
podcasts.
mess around all the time. Yeah.
But we don't.
No, it is a cool title because it is, climatographer. Is this something that you kind of came up with, the climatography group and everything?
Yeah, there are only two of us. So getting
Wow.
the top one doesn't really mean that much. But yeah,
I feel
we
sorry for the
actually
other
invented the
climatographer.
title based on combining climate change and cartography. In the sense that, in trying to solve climate change, we're trying to figure out how to navigate a map that no one has ever navigated before, and we don't know what the map actually looks like.
Yeah.
And so
Nice.
that's the cartographer side, obviously, and the climate side, and we came up with climatographers.
I love it.
Very cool.
It does have
it's a nice
Indiana
visual.
Jones. Yeah, it has it does have an explorer.
Oh, it does.
Sounding vibe
it does,
to it.
because you think about like the old map of California.
Yeah.
And how when they were going up the side of California, because you start in Baja,
Mm-hmm.
right, and you're going up, and if you kind of switch over, you go, well, there's an ocean over there because there's
Right.
there's water, and then you keep going up. It used to be on the maps that they thought California, like the whole western half of the U.S. was a different.
Yeah.
Like it was there was a little sea in between.
Yeah.
And then obviously later on they're like, well, that's not the case
That's
because
incorrect.
you're actually literally as you're going, you're tracing the map. You're making
Yeah.
the map as you explore.
Yeah.
So that's a great visual. So it's like it's exploring the solutions to the climate problem and then making the map as you go so that the people behind you can know where they are. Right?
You did it. You
Did
did
it.
it. Mark, are you're in California with us, right? You're on the West Coast.
Actually, in Oregon.
Oh, you're in Oregon.
That's West Coast.
Well, there we go. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's up in Oregon.
Yes.
That's right. I think I forgot that. But still, same time zone.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's beautiful up there in Oregon.
Yeah, when it's not burning down and
you're not
which
getting
it is,
record-breaking
which
heat?
parts of the state are right now, or when it's not 116 degrees, which it was 2 weeks ago. But otherwise, it's a beautiful place.
Otherwise, yeah, that was quite a rarity and quite an indication that maybe something's wrong in the atmosphere currently.
There have been a few of those of
Yeah,
late.
yeah.
Yeah.
What I wanted to do was just to kind of, of course, we're so happy to have you on the show. I wanted you to give us a little bit of a story, your story, kind of your personal journey so far, how you got into this line of work. I know you got 30 plus years of experience in energy and a lot of this stuff, but you'll be able to explain it better than I will. So I thought we'd start there.
Sure, and I still blame my high school ecology teacher for setting
Nice.
me down this path, and that was a long time ago. But Mr. Castile did a great job, and I've basically been on an environmental bent sort of ever since. So I founded an environmental group in college, and then went off to do graduate work in international environmental policy. And ultimately got hired into not really having known anything about climate change. In fact, while in graduate school, I had cited the only coal-fired power plant ever sited in California.
Wow.
But then got hired into the World Resources Institute in 1988 to work on this thing called climate change, and specifically to work on carbon offsets. And basically have been too stupid to get out since. And I started a consulting firm when I left the World Resources Institute. So it was the first sort of business-oriented consulting firm in the U.S., specifically working on climate change. We ultimately sold that. I joined an international company, Det Norske Veritas, based out of Oslo. I was director of climate risk. And when I left that, my wife and I sat down and said, we've accomplished absolutely nothing in 25 years. What do we want to try and do next? Right. And so that's the Climatographers, and that's our focus on sort of thinking a little bit originally about how might we actually make progress in this space? And we're focusing on it from a knowledge management perspective, in the sense that the information on climate change is infinite today. The problem is that no one actually ever sees the information that would most influence their thinking.
Right.
And so this idea of actionable knowledge and how do you help people find their actionable climate knowledge, that's where we're focused today.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Well, that's
so
why
real quick, before we go on, so is your wife the other climatographer?
My wife is the other climatographer.
Well,
She's an
there-
environmental attorney, and we've worked together for in various roles and capacities for quite a few years.
So what's her title in the climatography situation?
Legal counsel. It's
Legal
a fascinating
counsel
I
for
love
the
it.
class. So, okay, that's good.
Well, it's nice to work with your spouse, with your
come
partner.
on,
That's pretty cool.
awesome. Yeah, because you know
If you can survive the first 10 or so years, it's downhill from there.
Well, and that's why we'd like to
Fantastic.
welcome Mr. Bastille. His grade school teacher's coming on the
and
show.
he's coming out, ladies and gentlemen. Can you believe
We've
it?
got him behind the curtain, and he's coming out to say you're welcome for
That's
getting you.
hilarious. Yeah, that's great.
That was amazing. Oh, it's a lot of stuff that you've done in all the years, and I got a chance to take a look at the Climate Web, which is this thing that you guys have developed to create. You've created together, and there is so much information that's available on this site.
There is and it's overwhelming, which is the common reaction of people is wow, that's amazing, and then they run terrified in the other direction.
Sure.
So it's a challenge, because I mean, climate change is a complicated issue. Everybody needs different information. No one quite has the same actionable knowledge need. And so it's a really complicated question of infinite information on one side, infinite needs on the other side, and how do you link the two?
Yeah.
One of the things that we're doing, that we've actually developed a new technology in the last 6 months that allows us to extract information from the Climate Web into what looks like a conventional website. And these are our climate sites. So if you go to climatesites.net, you can find a whole series of what are basically websites that are much less scary.
Right.
But they help introduce people to the information in the Climate Web, because they're literally extracted from the Climate Web.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's good to give people the bite-sized bits they might be looking for, the things
Right.
that are going to help them specifically,
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
figure out what the problem is and what they can do to help and how they can jump in. That's really great. That's fantastic.
What I love about it too is that as you've been in this business for a very long time. I mean, in this industry, is that it is hard to communicate to people, and that's the reason why a lot of people have tuned out the message. Why we do the show that we do, which is the information immediately does become overwhelming. There's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do, and it has people running the other way. They shut down. They see the information and they go, it's too complex.
It's honestly one of the things, Mark, that we fight a lot on this show is breaking things down to a simple enough form that someone can understand it, and giving them a simple enough thing that they can try.
Yeah.
So people pick up something, so you get the mind frame change, right? Because once you kind of change your frame of mind a little bit, you're more willing to look at the bigger problem, the more complicated things. So this climate sites thing seems like a really, really cool idea, really cool resource. It's something that's people should check out. It's really, really great.
Hopefully it is, and it does explore a lot, sort of this question of individual action versus collective outcomes.
Sure.
And that's the real challenge we have with climate change, is that in the U.S. there are 100 million people that are alarmed or concerned about climate change, and by my estimate, having interviewed most of those people, there are 343 who actually know how to best tackle climate change.
Right.
And so it's a huge. If you ask most people, they will tell you, I recycle. Well, recycling's great. We recycle. Absolutely. Does absolutely nothing for climate change. And so the question of is there any way to turn individual action into the collective and systemic change that we need to get to? That's one of the things that we focus on. And that's our whole climate chess metaphor that we've come up with of thinking about this from sort of an enormous chessboard with thousands of pieces on it, and how can individuals be helpful in moving those pieces around the board, as opposed to trying to come up with the thing individuals can do that will make a difference.
Yeah. Could you explain that a little bit more? Because I know we talked about it briefly. We had talked about the whole climate chess thing. Would you give kind of a bird's eye view of what that philosophy is for the audience?
Well, one way to contrast it is that an Australian cartoonist did a great cartoon in 2010 called The Million Piece Jigsaw Puzzle. And it's a climate change jigsaw puzzle. And, there are about 20 pieces filled into this million-piece jigsaw puzzle. And the politicians in the puzzle are saying, we're doing a great job. Yeah. But the jigsaw puzzle metaphor sort of, in a way, encourages us all to create our own climate silos. So each of us works on our own thing, our own piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and somehow we assume that all those pieces are going to come together into this massively complicated puzzle. It's sort of like assuming that you've got enough chimpanzees in the room next door that while they're trying to type Shakespeare, they'll put together the million-piece climate change jigsaw puzzle.
Well, now, hold on. There's a lot of monkeys in Hollywood who've been working very hard together to make that perfect screenplay, and I think they've done pretty well.
They've done 9 Fast and Furious movies.
I mean, and they've been
9
hits,
of them.
every one of them.
So you got to give it up to those monkeys. They really know how to write a movie about family, cars, and explosions.
And explosions. Lots of, sometimes submarines through ice shelves.
And if we had 1,000 years, those chimpanzees might actually complete the million-piece jigsaw puzzle.
That's true. That's true, right?
The problem is we've only got, I hate to say we have a certain number of years because it's unrealistic, but during the next few decades, a lot of bad things are going to happen if we don't make a lot more progress. Sure. And so the idea is, instead of thinking of those million jigsaw puzzle pieces, what if you thought of them as pieces on a chessboard? And thought of sort of 2 teams, team urgency, which says we need to urgently do something about climate change, and team no urgency, which for a whole series of reasons doesn't feel the need to do anything urgent. They might actively oppose, they might actively deny, or they might just not care. And that's team no urgency. But team urgency's got this real challenge on the board, even though there's lots of people, lots of pieces on the board, lots of possible moves. It's much harder to create systemic change than to defend the existing system. And that's all team no urgency has to do, is to sort of block everything that team urgency is trying to do. And that's basically what's been happening for the last 30 years.
Right.
And, so going forward, what if team urgency actually realized it was playing climate chess and actually thought about how can we coordinate, how can we collaborate, how can we help each other move this piece on the board when that piece has a real opportunity to move. And then, a month later, another piece has a real opportunity to jump forward. So everybody comes together to help make that happen, as opposed to everybody just focusing on their individual piece, which is the way the world works today.
Yeah.
So where can, if people want to sign up to be a chess piece, where do they go?
Well, it's interesting because if people want to understand climate chess, they can go to climatechess.climatesites.net, one of these websites that's pulled out of the climate web. Yeah. If people want to sign up to be a chess piece, which would be absolutely great, there is absolutely nowhere for them to go. There is simply, because of the way the system works and the way that we're all competing against each other for resources and for funding, and NGOs are all competing with each other, there is nowhere you can go to say, hey, here's how much time I have, here's how many resources I have, here's my area of expertise, here's what I'm willing to do. Tell me every month how I can make the biggest difference. And then using artificial intelligence to sort through the tons of places you might direct those people and directing them to the best sources, that is not happening anywhere. And so these 100 million people are an enormous, just wasted resource, really, in tackling climate change, because they have no idea what to do, and they end up saying, I recycle.
Yeah.
Sure. And if you listen to this show, you'd have a good idea of exactly what's happening when you recycle.
Yeah, we did a couple shows on it being a good thing to do, but that it often is.
That's, there's better things.
There's better things. Yeah.
But that's okay. Good. Well, it's good to know. So that's interesting. So we'll definitely have to people check that out so they can get the concept put together. But it does sound like we got to get some work together to get the to get the chessboard.
Yeah.
Moving.
Find a Richard Branson or a Jeff Bezos, who wants to make climate just happen, and we'll be off to the races.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, and I know that I understand the concept that look, if everybody was organized and everybody was if everybody was working together in a coordinated fashion with an AI supermind moving them in the right place, that we get done a lot faster. But until we get Richard Branson or so on board. Where are some areas that someone could make, even if it was small, and even if it wasn't the be all end all move that would kill it, because there isn't a silver bullet here. Where are things you can look? Like you talked a little bit about carbon offsets, which I think is a very misunderstood topic. Is there something in that area where people could get a better understanding, perhaps, of what those are and how they can either create them or procure them, or
but before jumping into carbon offsets, let me sort of maybe answer the first question of what is it that people could actually do?
Yeah,
because ironically, and there's a huge literature on this, and ironically, there's pretty widespread agreement that the single most important thing that any individual could do is to simply talk to other people about climate change. And, we're afraid to talk about climate change because it's become so politicized. Who wants to bring it up at the Thanksgiving table?
Right.
Nobody wants to bring it up at the Thanksgiving table. And so we don't talk about it to anyone we think might not already be in, our tribe, so to speak.
Very true.
Right.
And that's a huge problem. And so if people could get over that, and there are all sorts of resources out there to help people talk to other people about climate change, and the Climate Web can certainly give people all they need to know to do that.
Yeah.
But that, ironically, is the thing that would make the biggest difference, and yet it is costless, relatively barrier free, except for our psychology. And so I thought that's worth throwing out there. First, because that's a huge option. I mean, if those 100 million people talk to their neighbors and their friends about climate change, the whole politics of climate change would change pretty quickly.
What I'm getting from what you're saying, Dr. Mark Trexler, the chief climatographer, is that he's recommending people listen to shows like the Biofriendly Podcast because they're so funny, and yet they're talking about climate change. So when you're at Thanksgiving and you're nervous about talking about climate change, you could just reference like a silly pun or quip from this show. So that's what I got from that.
I think that's word for word, basically.
Word for word. I mean, that's how I kind of translated what he was saying.
What I will say, to toot our own horn on that one, is that part of the problem that I think makes it so difficult to discuss and makes it so polarizing is that there have been, for those people who've been at this for a while and who've known about this for a while, and you certainly are one of them. I think that this is a really frustrating topic, and I think it gets aggravating to hear people just kind of not give any credence or attention or like to take it very seriously. So I think that over time the message has been militarized a little too much. And so what we try to do here, and what I think you could do when you're talking to your family and friends around the coffee table, is to remember that it doesn't have to be military. Like it's you can talk about it calmly, and you can talk about it openly, and you can listen to the other person's fears and concerns and worries about what's going to change and what's going to happen, and kind of talk them through it. Right? Like that's
absolutely, that's
all you can do, right? And then just try to be cool about it, man. Do your best to be cool. We're talking about cooling the planet.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, and if when grandkids are talking about this with grandparents, the grandparents aren't just going to shut them down and saying, "You wacko liberal."
Have you met my grandparents? I'm just kidding.
Young people can have a huge impact in some of these conversations.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But anyway, back to you. That was a great answer to his first part of his question. Now we can move on to his second question, which was more about carbon offsets.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic because it's actually something we've talked about a lot here. How people often use those as a way to if they have to go on an airplane somewhere, they go and buy the carbon offsets to try to limit the impact of it. So I think that this is a great opportunity, since you have a lot of experience in it, to explain to people what a carbon offset is and how they're created.
Okay. Well, I was asked recently, did you invent carbon offsets? And the answer to that is no, I did not invent carbon offsets, but I was hired to work on the first carbon offset. Oh. And so I have been around this space for a while. Yeah. And when we originally got into carbon offsets, literally the first carbon offset was 33 years ago.
Wow.
When the first carbon offset, nobody was talking about climate policy. Very few people were talking about climate change. Carbon offsets were sort of a way to get people having a climate change conversation and to have companies having a climate change conversation. And once electric utilities started saying, yeah, we'll offset some of our emissions, it becomes a lot harder to then say, well, obviously climate change is a hoax. Because you can't, on the one hand, be saying, yeah, we're offsetting our emissions, and on the other hand, say, wait, this is all a hoax. It doesn't really work.
Right. Sure.
And so in the early days of carbon offsets, no one ever believed that 33 years later we would be talking about voluntary carbon offset markets.
Sure.
Even the electric utilities, when I started working with electric utilities in 1991, those utilities thought they would be regulated by 1995.
Right.
So they actually thought that their CO2 emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions, would be regulated by 1995.
Right.
And they're not yet. So, it's important to sort of recognize that the context in which carbon offsets got going and the goal and the general conversation, as opposed to today when we're all in a panic over climate change and we're talking about net zero and what the role of carbon offsets there is. It might be quite different than it was 30 years ago. But let me sort of explain what an offset is and why it has been so fundamentally difficult to get the market right when it comes to offsets.
Great.
So first of all, I'll use the example of the first one. You had a small power company, AES, led by an environmental guy whose business model is named Roger Sant, and his business model was he wanted to build small power plants under a particular federal law at the time, a bunch of small power plants, 200, 300 megawatt, pretty small power plants around the country. And the only thing that would really pencil out for that was coal at the time in the 1980s. And there was nothing illegal about that at the time. People weren't really talking much about it. But he was an environmental kind of guy. And he said, I'm a little concerned about this climate change stuff, but the only fuel I can make work with my business model is coal. Right. So he went to the World Resources Institute and said, hey, is there something I could do to prevent the climate change impacts of building these coal plants, these small coal plants? Right. And WRI, World Resources Institute, worked with him and they invented the idea of carbon offsets. And in this case, they invented the idea, or they had the idea of, what if you go down to Central America and work with the relief agency CARE and fund an agroforestry project in Guatemala, and that agroforestry project takes pressure off of the natural forest because you don't have to do slash and burn agriculture. You get more biomass. You're much more productive with agroforestry. Yeah. And so if you do agroforestry, you save the next door forest, and you save at least the same number of tons of CO2 as the coal plants will emit. Great. And so this idea of offsetting, yes, you've got the emission here in the U.S., but you're avoiding an emission in Guatemala, and so the net impact is zero. Right. That's the idea behind a carbon offset, and that's where all carbon offsets have sort of sprung from. The difficulty is that for something to be an offset, it's got to be traceable back to the existence of a market for those reductions, for those credits. Okay. Because there's a lot of stuff going on all the time that reduces emissions. Everybody buying a Prius, everybody taking mass transit, everybody taking the train. All those things are in some abstract sense reducing emissions. Right. But paying people to do that doesn't make any difference at all because they're already doing those things. Yeah. So you've got to make new things happen. You've got to make additional things happen. And that's been the real challenge in offset markets, is how do you decide whether something someone is proposing as an offset is additional or would it have happened anyway? And a lot of people would argue that we've done a really lousy job of determining that. And so that an awful lot of offset funding has gone to things that would have happened anyway, and that therefore did not have any climate change mitigation benefit. And that's what the fight about offsets has been mostly about, is this question of, are they actually, it's not a theoretical question of could they do good, but the way we're doing them, are they doing any good?
See, that's fascinating, actually, because that brings you back to the last point you were making, which is, well, it's true that people are doing this anyway, and this is something like riding a train, right? It's so much better for the planet if you decide to take public transportation where there's 50 people on a bus instead of one person in a car, or where there's 1,000 people on a train instead of whatever, right? Yeah. Because it's more efficient. So that absolutely has an impact on the environment, and it's true. I mean, if people are going to do it anyway, then you're right. You got to create something new. I mean, you can't be counting that way. But on the earlier topic, I feel like this is an example of a simple change of tactic that, if more people did it, would have an enormous positive impact on climate change. If the popular idea was, I mean, right now it's a popular idea to get an electric car, but it's more efficient to just take the metro instead of driving yourself to work in whatever car, even in the electric one, if more people were doing that, right? So I don't know. It's just interesting because it made me think kind of back to that concept of like these little changes. These things are important. They do have a carbon emissions value, and if you get more people to do them, it would make a pretty significant impact.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. Obviously, if more people did real stuff, yes, you would reduce emissions. No question about that. Yeah. The problem is that how does that relate to systems change? How do you go from individual action? Because you're never going to have everyone and every company saying, "Hey, I'm going to offset all of my emissions." There's no way that you ever get more than 4 or 5%, perhaps, of people or companies to sort of step forward and do something totally voluntarily. And so when they do that, that's great, but you're still emitting 53 billion tons of CO2 instead of 54 billion tons of CO2. Yeah. So I'm by no means saying it's bad to do offsets. It's just that it's hard to see how it gets us to sort of overall systems change and to really decarbonize the economy.
Yeah.
Fair enough. We leave it at that. I mean, I could probably. I think I almost want to go out with you and have a beer, because there's a lot of like deeper, more interesting questions that I want to get into. But I think that for the purposes of the show, it would be kind of not very productive, because I would
and it'd have to be wine, but separate issue.
Wine. I love wine.
Wine guy.
I love wine.
We'll get some wine.
We can do sparkly water. I'm easy. Like chocolate milk.
No, we're definitely doing wine, because that's how you get into the good stuff.
No, because it's fascinating. I love what you're bringing to the table. It's really interesting. It's fascinating stuff, and I'd like to dig more into it. And maybe at some point we could dig more into it with the audience. Yeah. I'm worried that we'll both go on tangents that end us up.
You'll lose everybody's.
Goodness knows where. Yeah. So, but that's really fascinating.
Part of the biggest issue here is that everyone assumes that this issue of additionality is just a technical issue. Just go solve it. Well, it's not that easy.
That's fair.
And
that's fair.
Because as I mentioned, we once, on the back of an envelope, we sort of added up what are all the things happening in the U.S. already, business as usual, having nothing to do with carbon markets or voluntary offset markets.
Right.
So we added up, the renewable energy and the tree planting and the nuclear energy and the Priuses and the master. We added up all this stuff, and it came out to about 2 billion tons in the U.S. So that's 2 billion tons of good deeds, which are reducing emissions by 2 billion tons. Absolutely true.
Yeah.
But you can't let those 2 billion tons into the voluntary offset market, because they'll swamp the market with business as usual stuff.
Totally.
And nothing different will happen.
I think that's where you and I have a misunderstanding. I agree with you on that completely. I'm just, what I'm saying is I think that there's more value than I'm necessarily getting from you in increasing the voluntary tons that don't go into the market, right? Like just increasing, like if that were 4 billion, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, there's and here's an interesting point, that a lot of the things that individuals can do that don't add up to systems change.
Yeah.
It's still actually very important that they do them, because the whole psychology of individual action is such that if you're not at all concerned about climate change, or if you're not at all talking about climate change, and you're not keeping track of your carbon footprint and maybe thinking about carbon offsets, and if you're not thinking about any of that stuff, it makes it a lot less likely that you're going to go out and vote for a candidate who might actually create systems change.
Right.
And so doing these things as an individual doesn't necessarily impact the whole system, but is probably critical to your willingness to then do the things that might impact the whole system.
Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting because even going back to your earlier example on and I'm sorry we're bouncing around a little bit, but as you're talking about this, it's coming to me. Your earlier example of like better farming practices, right? Saving a forest. That, like, technically, because you didn't destroy the forest, that's a carbon offset. But even that, I would argue, is like, that's not a carbon offset, because that forest should never have been destroyed in the first place. You're just doing things better with the farming, right? Which, again, that comes down to education. That comes down to putting energy in doing that. And perhaps by giving someone a carbon offset, you're encouraging that to happen, so you are saving that forest. But it is interesting because you can go pretty deep down that line and say, like, look, I mean, if a forest is there, you shouldn't, like, for instance, Russia trying to get carbon offsets by protecting the Siberian forests, which, I mean, well, they're let's just, why do we have, like, they're there? why are we trying to turn those into carbon offsets? But then the flip side of that is, but then, if someone's paying attention to them, then they won't go away, which is good. So it's a fascinating point you bring up about how do you create the carbon offset, because you almost would want it to be more trees, not just protecting the ones that are there.
True enough, except for the fact that generally speaking, about 10% of anthropogenic human-caused emissions are from land use change. Right. And so in that sense, keeping that acre of forest intact in the Amazon that otherwise would have been cut down is literally, from a carbon perspective, is literally as worthwhile as planting 5 acres of trees someplace else. Plus, you've got the biodiversity and other kinds of benefits.
I mean, you take out carbon change. There's a million reasons why you'd want to do it. Yeah. Right. And again, I'm not discounting that. I'm just
no. I mean, you're right that a lot of these things, there should always be a question as to, is carbon offsets the right way to think about this, or is it public policy, or is it a rule of some kind? I mean, just for example, early on, there was a lot of thought about how could we set up a carbon offset system for buildings in Canada. So you'd have, each building would sort of say, well, here's what I would have done otherwise, and here's what I did, and therefore I deserve X number of carbon credits, and I'm going to sell those carbon credits to the building next door. And massively complicated thing. And we basically said, don't do that. Just create better building standards.
Yeah.
And so, rather than markets can be very useful in the right context, but a building standard can easily make up for a massively complicated attempt at building a market. Yeah. And so, in the case of forestry, we shouldn't be deforesting those areas, but to the extent we are, and to the extent that carbon offsets could help prevent that, then that's a legitimate carbon offset. The real question is, most people are used to paying $5 a ton for a carbon offset, and that's not enough to prevent somebody from cutting down an acre of forest in the Amazon. So there's this problem that the market really is sort of flooded with stuff that would have happened anyway, keeping the price really low. And so the really good projects out there have trouble getting the money they need to make really additional stuff happen.
Yeah.
It's an interesting conversation, because you got to figure out where is that line of what should be voluntary, what should be included, what should people be doing anyway, and what is inspiration for someone who's going to make a gigantic mess to make less of a mess, right? Yeah. And then you're right. The value of the offset is a big deal. Like $5 a ton is not a lot. I mean, that's the carbon market in Europe, I think, was up to 20 until recently. But it varies, right? I mean, it swings around depending on what's available.
It's actually, it's gotten up to 50 more recently.
Okay. Yeah.
Wow.
Which is pretty remarkable given that it was one, a couple of years ago.
Right.
And so the devil is in the details of how you design these markets and supply and demand. Because you got to remember, carbon markets are a very different thing, because somebody is deciding what the demand is going to be, policymakers.
Right.
Somebody's deciding what the supply is going to be, policymakers.
Right.
So you've got the same people sort of deciding supply and demand, and that's a weird context.
Sure.
It can be easily gamed, and it can lead to all kinds of mischief. And it's not like a wheat transaction where I'm selling you wheat. You can pretty easily know whether that wheat can be turned into bread or whether mice have been eating the stuff for the last 3 months. Right. And you shouldn't be buying it at all. With carbon offsets, you can't tell that. You can't. The person buying the thing has no idea what they're buying in that sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If only there was some kind of AI system that was playing like a gigantic game of climate chess, it could work us into a.
If only there was a climate web where you could get a lot of information from. No, that's
Mark, this is terrific.
In some ways, I've been trying to get away from carbon offsets for the last decade.
Right, right. And as you explain it, I can understand why. It's funny because when you came on, it was one of the questions I was most curious about, just because I thought, well, here's a way to explain to people what they're buying and what they're doing, and now you're flipping me on it a little bit, Mark.
Ironically, when I was still closely involved, and I was at a firm called Eco Securities, which had bought my firm here in the U.S. So Eco Securities was in the U.K., and I headed up the global consulting group and had offices around the world, but very active in carbon offsets. And my team came up with a scoring system for offsets. Because right now, basically, all you have to do is get approved by any one of a number of different entities as to whether your offset is an offset.
Right.
And some of those entities have higher standards than others.
Right.
And, if you can almost always find somebody willing to approve your project as an offset. But consumers, the people buying them, they have no way of knowing what they're buying. And so what do? They go for the cheapest thing they can find, which is not necessarily a good offset. So we actually came up with a scoring system, which was really innovative and would have said, hey, this offset is a 200 or this offset is an 800.
Right.
And it wouldn't say whether an offset was good or bad, but it would say, on a 1,000 scale, how much confidence can you have that what you're buying will make a difference for the planet? Yeah. And so for 200, you shouldn't have a lot of confidence, even though it's possible. Yeah. And for 800, you can have a lot of confidence, even though it's not absolutely guaranteed. Yeah. And we came up with the scoring system and we presented it internally. And some of the people in the company said, this is great. This would really help us differentiate ourselves in the market. Yeah. Most of the companies said, well, yeah, but wait a second. Remember that most of our projects would probably come in at a 300. And they said, well, that's the last thing we need. And so, we've had this scoring idea. We've talked about it with lots of people over the last decade, but it would so destabilize voluntary carbon markets in the sense that suddenly people would be able to know that they were buying an 800 or a 300, that people have just stayed away from it.
Yeah,
Mark, we're going to have to sit down over that wine and chocolate milk and have a deeper conversation, because I think we might be able to help you here. This is fascinating. This is interesting. I think that. We should catch up. This was really good. Yeah,
I love it.
This is really good because you're onto something, and I have some thoughts now in my head on how you could expand on that, and maybe we could do something with it. Anyways, that's great. That's great.
If you want, I can explain with an anecdote why additionality per se has been so difficult.
Okay. Yeah, please do.
And it's an anecdote that people get a big kick out of. I said this at one of the big international climate conferences in 2010. I analogized between additionality testing and pregnancy testing. Okay. And the whole room went into titters. But it's actually a perfect analogy. And the issue here is that you're sort of you're doing a hypothesis test. You're trying to decide, is this project additional? And you've got the possibility of a false positive. In other words, it's not, right. Or a false negative. It is, but you threw it out. Right. Or it's real. So you've got it's a typical hypothesis test kind of situation. Right. And not at all unlike trying to design a pregnancy test kit. Yeah. And when you design a pregnancy test kit, you're always going to have some false positives. You're always going to have some false negatives where you tell the woman she's not pregnant when she is, right. Yeah. And vice versa. And you've got to balance the two. You've got to decide which of those two problems is of bigger concern to me, because it is impossible to minimize both at the same time. Right. The more you minimize one, the more the other one increases. It's a statistical law. And so you've got to do this balancing act to figure out what's an appropriate balance. So with carbon offsets, number one, you've got to do this balancing act. But imagine designing a pregnancy test kit if you could never actually know whether the woman had ever been pregnant.
Wow.
How would you do that? It would be impossible, pretty much. Yeah. And yet that's what we're trying to do with additionality testing. Right. Because we can never empirically know whether a project truly was additional. So it's really like trying to design a pregnancy test kit without knowing whether a baby would have otherwise resulted or not. And that sort of gives you a sense of how challenging and why this issue has been so challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And
good analogy.
And that was, as you were talking through our podcast here, that was honestly becoming quite clear. Yeah. But that is the issue. Yeah. That's fascinating, Mark. Thank you. I think we're kind of running out of time here. We could go on for the rest of our lives, honestly. But
no, you've been
that's great.
Fantastic guest, and I really loved you joining us today and sharing your story and how you got involved and really breaking things down and making things more clear. And I look forward to future conversations, us coming up to Oregon, you coming down to our area, meeting up, having dinner, having that wine, and getting to know each other even more. But is there any kind of closing remarks you'd like to make, or is that good?
No, I think, just in the last couple of weeks, things are happening out there that are statistically impossible in terms of the fires in Oregon and the floods in Germany. Yeah. And so this is an issue that we all need to be thinking more about.
Yeah. Okay. Agreed. Keep those conversations coming, guys, in a nice way. Talk to those family members.
Well, just in a way that they can accept it.
You
don't have to always be nice.
You don't always have to be nice.
But just
you can be direct.
Give it to people so that they can have it, because you don't want people to just turn off, because that's what they do.
Yeah, that's what they do.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
And go to climatechest.climatesites.net and go to climatesites.net, and that lists all of our different websites using the climate web.
Yeah, we will link that with this episode. Okay. So make sure to check the links that we include when we put this episode out at the end of the week. So thank you for joining us. We usually do a little wrap up here, so you're welcome to exit the Zoom call, and we'll talk to you soon, Mark.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll talk to you.
Thanks so much.
Talk soon. Cheers.
Yeah.
It's great, right?
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
Yeah, it was awesome. Very smart fella.
That was fun. That was fun. I'll quietly, secretly record the sequel without anybody knowing when we get to hang out together. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, what I loved about it is I actually, Mark and I have talked a couple of times, and I've read a lot of stuff, but I probably saw in the information on him that he was involved in the first carbon credit, but first carbon offset. Yeah. But how cool is it that we got the guy involved with the very first one to kind of break down, like, this is how it all happened.
And basically shoot the whole system into pieces at the same time.
This is the system, but it's got holes, it's got problems. This is why it was invented in this year, and why people are scrambling for it now are two different things. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Well, but you know what? I mean, it's So people are using it now for other reasons, but its value is still the same then as it was now. It's just, is it worth it anymore?
Yeah.
And that's the thing that is fascinating to me, and that's the calculation that he kind of came up with. Because he says he's trying to get out of carbon offsets. It's fascinating to me because are they worth it anymore? If you are measuring whether something is additional or not, not even knowing if you've got it right, and then also to me, it is a larger and more interesting issue on like what individuals are doing, and if more of them are doing that, I mean, is that yes, that's valuable, but should that be taken out as a carbon offset to then lower the price of or make it more easier for people who are polluting to then pull off, and maybe not. Yeah. But it's
complex
it's fascinating. But at the same time, though, if you were to tell individuals that they're creating those carbon offsets and maybe they could sell them personally, would they be more apt to do better things for the environment?
Yeah.
And would that help? And then would it be additional?
Exactly.
See what I mean? I could go to, this would be it would really be a fascinating conversation to have with him, but it would take
a minute.
Hours.
Yeah, it would take some time. What I got from it was like maybe there's a lot of emphasis being put on carbon offsets when there shouldn't be.
Yeah, well, I think that is fascinating, isn't it?
That's
right?
what I got, like
going back to our Olympic one, right?
Maybe we're spending too much time talking about this stuff, and it doesn't necessarily.
Well, and
matter.
It's true. Like if the carbon offsets are protecting important jungles, important forests, but then I agree with them. And I'm glad they're doing that. They should be doing that.
Sure.
But I still am going to make the argument of whether or not that's additional, right? That's his point.
That's
you
his
don't
point.
know if it's additional.
That's his point.
it's
like
over.
it's that pregnancy test.
Yeah.
So, well, I love to have him on the show. And as you hear, we didn't acknowledge this up top because we kind of jumped in. We were talking to him, but Elise wasn't with us today. She was out of the office, so we had to fly without the full team.
Yeah,
but,
at least on vacation.
At least on vacation
and
today.
having a good time and earned it.
Yes, absolutely earned her time off. So, but that's it. So we are your beacon of light in a gloomy environment.
Carefully avoiding neonicotinoids.
We are the Siegfried and Roy and Meryl Streep of podcasts.
This show is a joke.
Never believe.
Step 1, chill out.
Spilling the teeth since 2019. That's it. Look at us. Flew through.
Unbelievable. I burped again.
You burped again.
I try to sneak one in every show.
Yeah. That's got to be your new thing. That's got to be your new thing.
Blurch.
Well, without our you're not going to hear the bye, so we'll do the cheerio and then we'll do her bye for her.
No, I think
leave it silent.
One of the things about when she's not here to make people sad
is there's no bye.
Is they don't get the bye. See?
My heart broke a little bit.
I know.
Okay,
but
ready?
that's how it goes. No one else can do the bye. You're right. We could never take that from
that away.
Yeah.
All right. So then, cheerio.
Oh.
It's the Biofriendly Podcast. It's the Biofriendly Podcast.